Here's a debate between the atheist Alex O'Connor and the Bishop Robert Barron.
Why do you believe in God, and specifically the Christian God, Bishop Barron? Because perhaps if you could make, if you like, the positive case, and then we'll hear Alex respond to it, and perhaps you can make the case for why he believes atheism makes more sense. This is our central question on the show today: Christianity or atheism, which makes best sense of who we are? How would you respond to that overall question then?
Well, again, we could look at some of the classic ways, Aquinas called them paths.
Well, he wrote in Latin, so more specifically, he called them viae, which can mean ways or paths or even roads.
I like that much better than, arguments or, absolutely convincing rational demonstrations. I think ways hits it much more accurately. I think you look at it both sort of protologically, eschatologically. Where does a contingent world come from? Or more precisely, how do you explain contingent states of affairs? The endless appeal to other contingent states of affairs won't work. You must come finally to some non-contingent ground.
This requires the assumption that there are, in fact, contingent states of affairs. Relativity seems to show us that all points in time are equally real. They all equally occupy reality. Therefore, no state of affairs seems to be dependent upon any previous state of affairs for its reality. Under this understanding of relativity, nothing begins to exist at its first moment in time any more than a yardstick begins to exist at its first inch.
Now, I'm summarizing that famous argument in just a couple of lines. But something like the quest for a foundation for a world that is radically evanescent, that's radically non-self-explanatory, that exists but doesn't have to exist. Now that goes back to the beginnings of philosophy, and the earliest philosophers were on that quest. And I think God is a very compelling answer to the question of how to explain contingent states of affairs.
Let's say that there are such things as contingent states of affairs. How is God the most compelling explanation for them? Even if the states of affairs within the universe are contingent, that would not mean that the universe itself is contingent. Why can't the universe itself be the first cause that Aristotle and Aquinas hypothesized? That seems much more compelling an answer than God, given that it is far from clear what a God even is or what it means to say that one exists.
But I do it the other way. I'm calling it eschatologically. There's a drive within us, both intellectually and at the level of will, toward what I would call the unconditioned. So the mind is looking for truths all the time, and it finds them, but it's never satisfied. It's one of the great marks of a real intellectual, that you're never satisfied with. Every question you answer opens up 100 more questions, and the mind just goes out, out, out. And it's by an inner dynamism pressing toward what I'd call the unconditioned truth, or truth itself. The will seeks the good and finds it in great acts of justice and so on. But it's never satisfied. It keeps opening to wider horizons. God, if you want, is not any of the things in the world that I might find, any of the truths my mind might discover. It's not some good that I might achieve, but a kind of luring horizon for the inner dynamism of the spirit.
Previously, you said it was a foundation. How is that the same as a horizon?
And I think God is a compelling answer to that, if you want, how to explain the contingency of the world, and then how to explain the inner drive and dynamism of the human spirit.
If God is the reason why the universe exists, that certainly wouldn't satisfy my inner drive and dynamism. If I were to be convinced that the explanation for the universe is God, that would open the floodgates to an ocean of additional questions. It would be the opposite of satisfying in that sense. I would in fact be less satisfied with the explanation that God did it than I would be with any answer that I could find within the universe. And what does Barron mean when he says that it's an explanation for the human spirit? Is he saying that humans are always seeking more answers, therefore there must be a God? How does that follow?
Those are, two kind of classical paths. I want to give Alex a chance to talk. I actually would like to say a few words about the ontological argument, because it gets at something that the arguments classically aren't getting at, but I'll leave it there for a second.
The ontological argument is ultimately circular, every version of it from Anselm's to Gödel's. It tries to prove the existence of God by tying the concept of God to the concept of existence. To say that something exists, however, is to say that it is more than merely fictional. That is, it's not just a concept, its concept has a referent. The ontological argument is a priori, which means it tries to prove that God is more than just a concept by using nothing but concepts, which, as far as I can conceive, is impossible. Simply defining a God in such a way way as to tie it to the concept of existence is just relating concepts to concepts. It doesn't and can't demonstrate anything extra conceptual, which is what you have to do to prove a thing exists.
I find it quite strange how the Christian might be able to say that, yes, our circle is getting bigger and bigger and the frontiers of our knowledge are getting bigger and bigger. But once we get to that certain point, there it is. We've got it. We have the full circle. We know what it is. We're now satisfied.
Which certainly wouldn't happen if the explanation for the universe did turn out to be God.
With contingency, when I was on your show before, there's an assumption, for instance, that contingent things exist, which is an assumption that often goes unanalyzed. You know, the idea that actually I could have not been born, or that you know, this glass that I've got on the table here could have been a mug instead, or something like this, is how contingency is often described. But as I spoke about before on your show, Justin, it's not clear that that's necessarily true. If, for instance, we live in a deterministic universe where everything is following a causal chain, whereby it actually couldn't have been different.
And relativity seems to indicate that it's not quite right to even think of reality as a chain of events in which an event occurs, which determines a second event, which determines a third, etc. Rather, since all events seem to equally occupy reality, they are not brought into reality by preceding events, not in a deterministic way or a non-deterministic way. They don't need to be brought into reality by preceding events if they are all equally real. It looks as though David Hume was right when he pointed out that we could be wrong to think of causality as one event being responsible for the occurrence of a subsequent event. We can't actually prove that there's what Hume called an inseparable and inviolable connection between any two events. Rather, what looks like causality could just be a pattern in how events are laid out rather than an explanation for any of their occurrences.
So there are certain assumptions that I think often go unanalyzed in these arguments. And you can have an entire discussion about the nature of contingent objects and whether they exist. But you can also have an entire discussion, if you just grant that they do, and say, is it not the case, as David Hume suggested, that if you have each contingent object explained by another contingent object, you've explained the whole? And there's plenty of discussion to be had there. The problem is that these discussions are so large and so wide-ranging that to say, actually, no, we've solved the problem, we've solved all of these holes that you can pick. We're going to plug them up with God, and not just as a God of the gaps, not just as a, well, we don't really know, let's just say that God did it, but as a kind of, no, this is the best explanation for all of these things. I fail to see it.
This is an especially inadequate explanation given how unclear it is what God is even supposed to be.
First, about contingency, I mean, the word itself, just from, cum tangere, I mean, to touch with. So this state of affairs obtaining right now, that I'm speaking to this machine, which is conveying information to you across the ocean, that light's shining on me right now, this state of affairs is contingent in the measure that it depends upon a set of causes extrinsic to itself.
That's not what relativity seems to show. I'll put a link in the description to a video in which I explain in detail why this is the case. But for now, suffice it to say that from certain frames of reference, all events are simultaneous. If events are all simultaneous from certain frames of reference, then the occurrence of any event doesn't depend on the occurrence of any prior events, because in those frames of reference, there are no prior events. All events happen at once.
So I put the question of determinism to the side. I mean, we can discuss that separately, but the contingency of this state of affairs is simply the fact that it's being caused by another state of affairs. Now, is that state of affairs itself contingent or non-contingent? If it is contingent, it's explained by some other set of causes. So I don't think look, people in the religious sphere who believed in determinism also accepted the argument from contingency. So I don't think determinism really affects the meaning of contingency.
It does if everything occupies reality non-contingently, as relativity seems to show it does.
That just means it's being touched upon by some kind of causal agency. Now, can that process proceed to infinity? So I'd quarrel with Hume there, because Aquinas distinguishes between a infinite causal set subordinated what he calls per accidens and subordinated per se. Per accidens would be, you had a father who had a father who had a father, back. In that kind of causal series, that could be infinite, because the present existence of the first element is not dependent here and now upon the higher elements.
Which relativity seems to indicate is the case with everything.
But one subordinated, Aquinas says, per se, is where there's a here and now causal dependency. So the fact that it's not 1,000 degrees in this room right now, the fact that whatever's making those lights go is going, the fact that I have oxygen to breathe, all that's making this state of affairs real. It's actualizing a potential.
No, according to relativity, every state of affairs everywhere in the past, present, and future of the universe is equally real. Therefore, nothing needs to make anything else real. I don't think there's any real distinction between potentials and actuals because from some relativistic frames of reference, everything that can happen has, in a sense, already happened. All true potentials are actual.
Well, how do you explain that? Well, that has to be explained through another set of causes, etc. That kind of causal series, I'd say Pache Hume, cannot proceed to infinity because then the suppression of a first element would indeed entail suppression of the subsequent causal elements. So I think that's the kind of causal series that the argument from contingency is quarreling with.
And relativity very much makes the universe look like there isn't any such thing as that kind of causal series.
Now let me say a quick thing too, because I loved your comment actually about God and the setting of limits. Because what came to my mind was Augustine's famous dictum, where he said, si comprehendus non est Deus, right? If you understand, that's not God.
Then what do you even mean when you say you believe in a god? This sounds like Augustine and this dude admitting to Igtheism. This dude's a theological non-cognitivist. He admits that he doesn't understand what a god is any more than I do. But if you don't understand what a god even is, then how do you believe that one exists? I don't believe in a god precisely because I don't have the first clue how to believe in something if I don't understand what it is or what it even means to say that it exists. That's what I mean when I say I'm an Igtheist. So what does this dude mean when he says he believes that God exists? If he doesn't understand what a God is, how can he believe that one exists? Sometimes apologists will answer this question by saying something like, well, you don't understand everything about how your car works, but you still believe it does. But that's not really analogous because while I don't understand how my car works, I understand what it means to say that my car works. I understand what my car is. I don't just fail to understand how God works, I don't understand what a God even is. And it sounds like Bishop Barron doesn't either.
Which is why we purposely use language like horizon, the sort of like ever retreating. Think of Ignatius of Loyola. God is semper maior, always greater, always more. So you're right. If we were to say, boom, end of it, got it, understand it, got it figured out, that's not God we're talking about.
Well, earlier you said that he's a compelling explanation for the contingency of the universe. If you don't understand what God is, how can he be a compelling explanation for anything?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.